Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today on Exploration, some of the big stories in science. Well, one story which has hit the headlines just last week was when Vice President Pence came out and laid out a blueprint for the Space Force. Yes, we're not talking about space cadets. We're not talking about the snickering that's going on behind closed doors. No, we're talking about a real program being pushed by the White House to the tune of $8 billion to set up the sixth branch of the military, the first new branch to be set up since 1947. And a timetable was even laid out by the Vice President that by 2020, yes, by 2020, this news. And the question is, well, what are the consequences of such a big change in our military structure, given the fact that, well, yes, let's not be naive about it. The Chinese, the Russians, a lot of nations are experimenting with killer satellite technology, which could be used in a potential war in outer space. So today on Exploration, we're going to talk about the pros and cons. The pros and cons of what happens when we weaponize the heavens. What happens when we have hydrogen bombs, laser cannons, kinetic energy weapons in orbit around the planet Earth. So we'll say a few things about the militarization of outer space, and then we'll say a few things about inner space. It turns out that one of the great afflictions, mental afflictions affecting humanity is depression. If you take a look at the sheer numbers, you realize that depression is by far the largest source of mental illness or mental impairment. And unfortunately, we scientists are like children when it comes to understanding the brain. However, at MIT, there was a very interesting breakthrough that was announced just this week, and that is they found a portion of the brain, a localized part of the brain that seems to dictate depression and pessimism and optimism. In fact, by manipulating this part of the brain, you can actually make animals more pessimistic and hence more depressed. Well, we'll say a few things about that on Exploration. Well, let's just jump right into the top story of the past week in science and politics, and that is the Space Force. You know, a lot of commentators sort of like snicker late at night talking about space cadets and has the president lost his marbles? Have they been sent into outer space? But I think this is a serious proposal that should be taken very seriously. In fact, some commentators have said that perhaps the president views this as one of his lasting legacies. Long after he's gone, the legacy will be the creation of a U.S. Space Force. And so the question is, what are the pros and cons concerning the establishment of a new branch of the United States Pentagon? Well, yes, it's full steam ahead for the Space Force. By 2020, the president wants to have it up and running, and immediately he's called for 3 initiatives that are already sending Pentagon officials into a flurry. First of all, he wants to set up a U.S. Space Command. This has been talked about, but now he wants to push it as a reality. A U.S. Space Command which will begin to assume some duties concerning monitoring outer space and making decisions. Next, hiring. Hiring that can begin as early as this year, hiring a corps of experts who are skilled in the technology of warfare in outer space. And then satellites. Number 2 would be to buy satellites. So no agency of the government is fully functional unless it has control over its own satellites. And yes, the U.S. Space Command would be given the authority to buy satellites. And then setting up a command structure. This would become the nucleus of the U.S. Space Command. And of course, officials in the United States Air Force are not happy about this at all. In fact, even the former U.S. Secretary of Defense for the Air Force came out and made critical comments about the U.S. Space Force, but some of that has to be put into perspective. After all, the United States Air Force stands to lose an arm and a leg if the United States Space Force is created by taking huge chunks of the Air Force and putting it into a new branch of the military. So that has to be taken with a certain amount of a grain of salt. Now, it still needs congressional approval. The three initiatives I mentioned, including setting up a corps of experts and buying satellites and setting up a command structure, all of these could be done without congressional approval. However, ultimately, Congress has to weigh in. Congress has to say yes or no to the president's plan to create a new Space Force. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a Space Force? It's one of the duties of scientists to analyze the pros and cons of any technology so that the public and politicians have the best scientific evidence available. Well, one of the advantages is, well, let's face it, space is getting cluttered. A huge portion of our digital economy is, of course, done in outer space. We're talking about the Internet, GPS, weather satellites, telecommunications, commerce. The digital economy, let's face it, its future is in outer space. And so the question is, what would it take to disrupt the digital economy? Well, first of all, let's not fool ourselves. Of course, nations pay generals to win wars. They don't pay generals to lose wars. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians and the United States have all war-gamed different scenarios of war in outer space. So let's summarize now what is known and not known about the weapons capabilities of the great powers, starting with the Chinese. Back in 2007, over 10 years ago, the Chinese stunned the world of military science by shooting out one of its own satellites. The United States did not know that the Chinese had this capability 10 years ago. There was an old, derelict Chinese weather satellite that was doing nothing. And so the Chinese then launched another satellite which had the capability of shooting out the old weather satellite. It created enormous amounts of debris. Over 2,000 pieces of space debris were created by that. And of course, the Russians and the United States were furious about this because it cluttered up our space lanes, making it more dangerous for us to send astronauts into outer space. And then just a few years ago, something else happened which rattled the Pentagon. Just a few years ago, the United States tracked a Chinese missile being sent not just into orbit, which is, of course, just a few hundred miles from the surface of the Earth, but to the geosynchronous radius of 22,000 miles, where we have military and communication satellites vital to national security. The Chinese sent one of their missiles way out there, 22,000 miles from the surface of the Earth, and they buzzed one of our satellites. Of course, there was no damage done, but it was just sort of like a wake-up call. The Chinese were more or less announcing that, yes, they too had the capability that if they felt like it, they could wipe out U.S. telecommunication satellites and military satellites 22,000 miles in outer space. So the Chinese have shown that, yes, they are fully capable of fighting a war in outer space. Now, the Russians, of course, are even more advanced. They have publicly stated that they are working on new generations of space weapons. First, the laser cannon. It turns out that laser cannons can be used in, for example, ship-to-ship battles inside the atmosphere of the Earth over a close distance. But nobody has yet perfected an operational laser cannon which can shoot down a satellite from the Earth or blind a satellite from the Earth. That would be, in some sense, an act of war if that were to take place. But the Russians have announced that, yes, they are working on laser cannons, and guess who else is working on laser cannons? Yes, the United States is also working on laser technology, which can blind or destroy satellites by a push of a button from the planet Earth. Now, of course, there are problems with this. It turns out that much of the laser power is absorbed by the atmosphere of the Earth. And therefore, there are other plans to have other killer satellites with the capability of shooting out laser beams in outer space, where there is no atmosphere to absorb most of the energy. And also, the United States Pentagon has been complaining that both the Chinese and the Russians seem to be ahead of us in one category, and that is hypersonic weapons. Now, what the hell is that? First of all, we have supersonic weapons that can go a few times the speed of sound, but hypersonic weapons come blazing in from outer space many times faster than the speed of sound, capable of evading a Star Wars system. Now, let me explain. Ever since the days of Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s, the United States has spent billions of dollars trying to perfect a Star Wars system that can reliably shoot down Soviet missiles in a nuclear war. What do we get from it? Well, almost nothing. Even now, there is no operational system capable of knocking out an ICBM with accuracy and reliability in outer space. However, with not that much money, it's possible that an adversary can evade a Star Wars system by making their nose cones maneuverable. So as their hydrogen bombs enter the atmosphere over the Earth, they would then start to have fins which would allow them to maneuver at hypersonic velocities, thereby evading the radar and the detection systems of a U.S. Star Wars systems. And sure enough, in April of this year, Vladimir Putin announced that they have a hypersonic weapon that can indeed evade U.S. radar and U.S. Star Wars systems. Now, is that true? Well, we don't really know for sure. However, the military has publicly stated that they seem to be behind both the Chinese and the Russians when it comes to hypersonic weapons. Now, should we be concerned about this? Well, marginally, yes, because we are talking about weapons that are very difficult to control. It turns out that 2 years ago, the United States also had a hypersonic program, but it gave it up because it was too unstable. These weapons travel at enormous velocities, the velocities comparable to that of a nuclear weapon entering the atmosphere, and then to make them maneuverable and controllable was simply too much. And so the United States Air Force gave up on it 2 years ago. But now that the Russians and the Chinese have announced that they're making progress on this, we may see a revival of hypersonic funding. So now the question is, what does it all mean when you put it all together? So the positives are that a Space Force would be, in some sense, the cop on the block. More and more nations are sending probes into space. The Indians can do it. The Japanese can do it. They can reach the moon. They can reach Mars, in fact. So what the president is saying is that we're going to be the new sheriff in town. We're going to be the one bringing peace and order to the chaos of outer space, especially when it's so critically important to the economy and national security. Well, now let's look at the cons. Let's look at the problems involved with setting up a Space Force. First of all, the Chinese have an expression: never pick up a rock, only to drop it on your own feet. In other words, things can backfire on you. And let's face it, who's the most vulnerable to a potential war in outer space? The Chinese, the Russians, are they the most vulnerable if war breaks out? No. We're talking about the United States. The United States has heavily invested in commercial satellites. In fact, over half the commercial operating satellites in orbit around the Earth today are American. And so if war were to break out, we would be the first ones to suffer the most. And how would it happen? It doesn't take much to knock out a satellite. Satellites are not reinforced. They usually don't have redundant systems. They can't maneuver unless they're military satellites with secret technology. And in a worst-case scenario, even a small nation like North Korea could detonate a hydrogen bomb over Kansas, let's say. The shock wave from the electromagnetic pulse would be enough to blind or disrupt about 50% of our satellites in outer space, blinding us. We would be blind without radar, without the internet, without telecommunications. And then when that radiation from that atomic bomb hits Kansas, we're talking about sending out an electromagnetic pulse that could affect communications, power plants thousands of miles away. So we're talking about blackouts. We're talking about the fact that the Internet not only goes down, but your TV set, your refrigerator, telecommunications are short-circuited by the electromagnetic pulse. When refrigerators are out, it means that in a few days, food riots could break out because all the food in the refrigerator starts to rot. Communications and the economy comes to a halt because, for example, credit card transactions cannot be lodged with the Internet anymore because the Internet is out. So we're talking about economic chaos that could break out if even a single atomic bomb were to be dropped over Kansas. And so you realize that, yes, we are the ones who are most vulnerable if a war were to break out. And then the next question is, well, what do we do about it? Reinforce all our satellites? Well, we have over 600 commercial operating satellites in orbit around the Earth, over 600. And are we going to reinforce all of them? It'd be impossible. We don't have the technology to maintain the servicing of that many satellites in outer space. So we have an Achilles heel. We are a sitting duck to a preemptive strike because we don't have any ways of protecting our satellites if an electromagnetic pulse were to be unleashed in outer space. Now, then you may say to yourself, is this science fiction? Is this for real? And the answer is yes, it's for real. We have actually tested nuclear weapons detonated in outer space. Now, we've all seen pictures of hydrogen bombs detonated on the Earth. But yes, we have detonated hydrogen bombs in deep space as well. And we were shocked by the consequences. Back then, we didn't know about the electromagnetic pulse. So when we detonated a hydrogen bomb in outer space, all of a sudden we found that telecommunications was disrupted. For example, transatlantic communication between San Francisco and Tokyo was disrupted. In fact, in Hawaii, burglar alarms were set off over Hawaii because of the electromagnetic pulse. And since then, on the Earth, we have simulated the electromagnetic pulse and have exposed old airplanes to the electromagnetic pulse. If you simply Google it, you can actually see pictures of old airplanes whose communication systems were hit by an artificial electromagnetic pulse in the desert, just to see how badly we would be affected. And yes, it turns out that we have underestimated the power of the electromagnetic pulse. For example, if a hydrogen bomb were to be detonated on the Earth, the kill radius would be about 100 miles. 100 miles from ground zero, we're talking about enormous devastation because of the heat flash, because of the shock wave, because of the radiation released. However, if that same bomb were to be detonated in outer space, the electromagnetic pulse is not going to stop at 100 miles. No, it's going to go on for thousands of miles because there's no air to absorb all the radiation. And so we're talking about potential chaos that could erupt if a war were to break out in space. And the Russians and the Chinese have announced that if we do go ahead with a space force, then they're not going to sit back and simply twiddle their fingers. So what do we do about it? Well, let's go back to the 1980s and see what Ronald Reagan did about that situation. When he was briefed about what would happen in case a real nuclear war were to erupt, he realized that the arms race had to be managed. He had a two-pronged strategy. The first prong was, of course, peace through strength. And everyone remembers that. That was President Ronald Reagan's mantra when it came to increasing the funding of the Pentagon. Peace through strength. But he also cut a deal with Gorbachev. He realized that if a nuclear war were to spiral out of control, nobody would benefit. Americans would die just as quickly as Russians. So he cut a deal with Gorbachev. So some people are saying that what we ought to do is revise the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Now, that was 50 years ago. But the United States signed the Outer Space Treaty and is held to it. And the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 basically says two things. First, no nukes in outer space. And that's one reason why we have not detonated nuclear weapons in outer space ever since the first tests were conducted back in the 1960s. That's the first provision. The second provision is ownership of celestial bodies. No nation can claim the moon. Now, you begin to realize that this treaty is way out of date. Because now, in addition to nuclear weapons in outer space, we have advanced non-nuclear weapons in outer space, like laser cannons, like kinetic energy kill weapons, like killer satellites. Even a small nation, for example, can take a barrel of nails and detonate it in outer space. And the shrapnel coming from all these nails will be sufficient to wipe out any number of delicate satellites orbiting the Earth because they have no shielding. They have no protection. They have no Star Wars program of their own, and they're just sitting ducks out there. That's one provision. And back in the 1960s, who would have thought? Who would have thought that private individuals, not nations, but private individuals would have the capability of fielding a moon rocket and in principle put their corporate flag on the moon? That was considered preposterous 50 years ago, but guess what? Here we have Elon Musk, a hero to many visionaries who realize that, yes, private individuals are now capable of fielding moon rockets. And so the point here is that some people are saying that perhaps what we ought to do is rethink the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. This does not mean banning all research, because, of course, research can always be done secretly without anyone knowing about it. So we're not talking about banning everything. That's practically impossible. But we're talking about regulating it, monitoring it, setting the ground rules so that a confrontation in outer space doesn't simply flare up and become a full-fledged war in outer space, which we cannot win because we are the most vulnerable, and we're going to be the most vulnerable for decades to come. Because how are we going to reinforce the hundreds of satellites that we have orbiting the Earth at the present time? And so, once again, perhaps Ronald Reagan, when he cut a deal with the Soviets, was not totally wrong in saying that, well, yes, we have to be able to manage a nuclear war so that it doesn't spiral out of control. In conclusion, there are several scenarios that could be played out over the next several years to decades. One scenario is that this initiative by the president is a harmless one. It's nothing but musical chairs, bureaucrats within the Air Force being shuffled around to create another bureaucracy, which simply adds to the U.S. debt. It simply adds to the taxpayers' burden. That would be the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is it militarizes space. The Russians and the Chinese say that, well, they too have to modernize their killer satellites, and an accident, the smallest accident, could spark a nuclear confrontation. However, I think the best outcome would be to revise the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. When you read it, it's like reading a comic book from the 1950s. It's so out of date. The capabilities today dwarf anything imagined by the politicians and scientists back in 1967. And so I think we should take a hard look at whether or not we can renegotiate the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 to bring it up to date, to make sure that the ground rules for outer space and conflicts in outer space are well known and well understood to prevent any spiraling out of a crisis. And lastly, I'd like to say a few things about, well, inner space rather than outer space, specifically what goes on inside your brain. Now, one of the greatest afflictions, mental afflictions of the human race is depression. It far outweighs the number of people afflicted by, for example, schizophrenia. 1% of the human race, approximately, are afflicted by schizophrenia, in which case you begin to hear voices. But depression, depending upon how you count it, at one point or other in a person's life, perhaps 20, 30% of the population is afflicted by depression. And what do we do about it? Well, we are children when it comes to understanding the mechanisms of the brain. But if you get a copy of my earlier book, The Future of the Mind, we talk about some of the latest developments. First of all, there is counseling and therapy, which works pretty much as well as simply doing nothing and letting it run its course. So we do not have good statistics when it comes to counseling and therapy of that nature. Drug therapies work a little bit. However, we are simply children again when it comes to understanding the nature of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. However, recently, people have been able to pinpoint certain parts of the brain itself which are linked to depression. If you read my book, The Future of the Mind, you realize that there's one specific point of the brain which, if you stimulate electrically, can actually eliminate a very severe form of depression. However, there are many, perhaps hundreds of different kinds of depression, some of it genetic, some of it environmental, some of it developmental, and we're still clueless as to how to bring it all together. But at MIT just last week, it was announced that they found a part of the brain, the caudate nucleus, which seems to be involved in pessimism. Now, if you take a look at the animal kingdom, you realize that animals have to do a cost-benefit analysis. They have to say, well, if I reach out and grab that food, will I expose myself to possible predators? So there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes on in the brains of animals. Animals do this all the time whenever they try to eat. They analyze the risks involved. It turns out that if you stimulate this area too much, pessimism starts to rule. The animal becomes super cautious and shies away from taking any risks. And so this most basic circuit, the reward versus benefit circuit, actually is gradually being unraveled now by scientists. And of course, we humans have that as well. And the speculation is that this part of the brain is involved with depression. Because if pessimism becomes out of control, then we think that no matter what we do, we're going to fail, that we're worthless, that there's no point in attempting something because, well, we're not going to succeed anyway. And so even though this is certainly not a cure for depression, it gives us understanding of a possible pathway by which some people become depressed because of a feeling of hopelessness caused by depression. Next, of course, they're going to try to find the optimism area to see whether or not you can stimulate optimism in an animal and eventually in a human being as well. To sum up, we do not have a cure for depression that works all the time. However, because of science, we're gradually beginning to understand the mechanisms of the brain that may one day allow us to control debilitating mental illnesses like schizophrenia, like bipolar, and also depression.